All right, goodbye germ theory. Why do I say a lot of that? Let me give you another quote from an MD. Using the coercive apparatus of the state to force people to submit to the ministrations of doctors of medicine is a persecution in the name of health, exactly as using the coercive apparatus of the state to force people to submit to the ministrations of doctors of divinity, as this was in the persecution of the name of God. Strong statement, but I agree with that. That's why I put it in my book. I want to go over the differences between what really happened in 1878 very briefly with two scientists. One was named Pasteur, the other was named Pierre Bouchamp. Anybody ever hear of Pierre Bouchamp before? Thanks, Alex. I know you have. Pierre Bouchamp was a brilliant scientist of his day, a contemporary, actually, to Pasteur. And he was more of the honest, meek one, never really made the press. Pasteur was more of the out in the public eye, greedy kind of one. Bouchamp did many fascinating experiments that were later confirmed by a scientist called Raymond Rife in the 1920s, and we'll go over a few of the things that he had said. But Bouchamp's whole thesis, first of all, we know where the medical people at the time wanted to go. They needed a theory. They needed some sort of ghost to be scared of. And Pasteur was their front man, essentially. If you read history to where it's at, everything that you've heard about Pasteur has been edited nicely. Anyway, Pierre Bouchamp was contemporary to him, did research also with certain types of microscopes, found that there were very, very tiny little bodies that are, again, if a bacterium is a Cadillac, then these tiny bodies that he found, which he called microzyma, were about the size of raisins, all right? And he found them everywhere. He did experiments on dead carcasses and just noticed that all the cells, when there was dead or diseased tissue, had these little dots in them. He didn't know what they were. He theorized at that point that, and discovered through his microscopy, that these particular forms of life, these microzyma, which he called them, evolved into every different form of bacteria, virus, and what are now called germs. Depending on what? Depending on what? Depending on the medium that the microzyma were put into. Depending on what the need was. So, if you have a garbage strike, and the garbage men aren't coming, and the garbage builds up on the street, who's going to come to help? Yes, rats! Bacteria are also going to come. Break it down. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. It starts with the rats, right? The vultures are going to start getting in there and eating everything up. Everything has a purpose, right? Well, if you have a toxic internal environment, Bouchamp was saying in his papers just as loudly as Pasteur that no, it's not one organism, one disease. It's not these opportunists that are coming in and making you sick with this one thing. It's actually, these bacteria are good. These microorganisms are good. They're actually little Pac-Men that are inside of your cells eating up all the toxicities. And what he had seen was many of these things. He discovered that the medium determines whether or not microorganisms such as bacteria or not are present. If there was normal healthy tissue, you just have microzyma. However, as soon as you took diseased tissue, all these different organisms started showing up. The microbes that arise from your cells, quite possibly through Bouchamp's microzyma, are members of the web of life called saprophytes, or saporophytes. These are defined as a group of microorganisms whose sole existence is designed by God to break down dead, diseased, or dying organic material into its simple forms of organic chemicals. These are vultures. These are microscopic vultures that do the dirty work on the inside. So whenever you see them around, they are not hurting you. They're just taking the blame. All right, now this is fascinating stuff. Around the turn of the 20th century, there were some interesting technological advances which gave birth to the work of another brilliant American scientist named Raymond Rife. Raymond Rife invented the dark microscope, the dark field microscopy. Anybody ever heard of that? Essentially, you're using ultraviolet light to look at things under the slides. All right. Bouchamp theorizes, well, Jesus, there's something we're not seeing here. I just sense it. I can see the microzyma, but I need something else. So Rife was a big fan of Bouchamp, And at the time when he passed on, Rife said, well, maybe it's the lighting that we're missing. And so brilliantly, he had an inspiration and invented quartz crystal microscopes, which are still around today, which you can get. And he looks at things through what's called dark fields. And these particular microscopes can see things in ultraviolet light. And when you look, it's like a whole other world that you're stepping into. And what he saw here were, he postulated that something, okay, we all went through this. He found Beauchamp's microzyma. He discovered, when he found the dead, dying material, Rife discovered that these small units of life spontaneously evolved into the varying forms of larger microorganisms solely dependent on the type of tissue in which they existed: sick, diseased, partially, or healthy. And this argument was around in the 1920s. It's just not, it's out of the history books now. For example, the Journal of the Franklin Institute in Pennsylvania, where my son goes on many of his field trips, wrote an article about Rife's work in 1944. The title was "The New Microscopes." Let's read that, because this is interesting. Rife showed that by altering the environment and food supply, friendly germs such as colon bacillus can be converted into pathogenic germs such as typhoid, and that process is reversible. Experiments in the Rife lab established that the virus of cancer, like viruses from other diseases, can easily be changed from one form to another by means of altering the media upon which they feed. With the first change of the media, the cancer virus becomes enlarged, looking very much like E. coli. Observation under an ordinary scope is made possible through a second alteration in media. A third change is undergone upon an asparagus-based media, where the cancer virus is now transformed from its filterable state into Cryptomyces pleomorphi fungi. Isn't that fascinating?